Hello, welcome back to Third Sense. I'm Clem Harold. Today I want to talk about the Canadian psychologist Jordan B. Peterson. As I'm sure you're aware, in 2016, Jordan Peterson rose to fame for opposing Bill C-16 in Canada, which was this bill from the Canadian government sort of mandating that you use the correct pronouns for transgender individuals. And since then, he's had this rather meteoric rise to fame. He's written a couple of books, 12 Rules for Life, more recently, Beyond Order. And Jordan Peterson, I think we can certainly agree, is someone who has a lot of good to offer. He's someone that I found very inspiring at times and really insightful. He has this kind of Socratic spirit where he's really tried to follow the arguments where they lead. And yet, I would say this. I would say that as a Christian, I can't help but look at Peterson and think that he doesn't quite go far enough. See, Peterson is someone who sees the value of faith. He sees the value of the biblical stories. And yet, he's someone who feels unable to fully commit himself to their underlying truth. So I think in Catholic terms, we would say that Jordan Peterson is very much stuck in the moral sense of Scripture. So he sees the value of virtue, the value of discipline, the value of hierarchy, all these things. And yet, he can't formulate the underlying metaphysical framework behind it. And the problem with this is that the Bible on this view, it risks being reduced to a kind of self-help book. Maybe especially good self-help book, but it's still only that. It's a book that's devoid of the power, devoid of the promise which the Christian narrative offers. And in this respect, I want to say this. I want to say that Jordan Peterson is quite like the ancient Stoic philosophers. I'm thinking here of someone like Marcus Aurelius, that 2nd century Roman emperor and philosopher. Marcus Aurelius was someone who was all about the natural law, being virtuous, having this sort of magnanimity of spirit. And he even talks at times about the fragment of divinity that's within us, and he talks about the providential care of the gods. And yet, Marcus Aurelius, he also says this in his Meditations. At one point, he makes this observation. He says, the infallible man does not exist. And it seems to me that's a really profound point, because I want to say that Jordan Peterson is stuck in the same paradox. Jordan Peterson really believes that the infallible man does not exist, and indeed cannot exist. He explained in an interview earlier this year, a sort of online interview with Jonathan Peugeot, that it's Christians primarily who make it very hard for him to believe. For Jordan Peterson, it's the hypocrisy and the double standards of Christians that hold him back from really believing in the truth of the gospel message. G.K. Chesterton, he made a similar point. He said that the best argument against Christianity is us. The best argument against Christianity is Christians. And I really believe that's not some trite bromide. You know, I think Chesterton is actually right. There are no great arguments against Christianity except this one thing, which is that question of why, if this is true, do its effects seem so unapparent? If Christianity is true, then why are our lives not more changed? So what's the Christian response to this? Well, I think the Christian response has always been the person of Jesus Christ. You know, Pope Benedict, he made this point in one of his encyclicals. He said that being Christian is not the result of an ethical choice or a lofty idea. Being a Christian, he says, is an encounter with an event, or rather a person. And it's this encounter with a person which gives life a new horizon and a decisive direction. And so you see, I think Jordan Peterson is quite right to sense the hypocrisy of Christians. He's quite right to feel the force of this as a challenge to belief. And yet, we still have the person of Jesus. We have this figure in the Gospels who we have to ask, who is this man? And why is it that he could claim to be so much more than just a man? I'm thinking here of C.S. Lewis's famous argument, which remains, I would say, as potent today as it was 60 years ago. For Lewis, he points out that we have these historical portraits in the 4 Gospels, portraits with multiple independent sources, historically well attested, and they paint us a picture of someone totally unique in human history. This Jesus figure who comes to the fore in the Gospels is not someone that Jordan Peterson can just dismiss as a kind of kind-hearted preacher or a self-help guru. Jesus Christ, Jesus of Nazareth, in the Gospels is someone who makes the most audacious of claims. And in any other human being, I'm convinced, we would view those claims as exhibiting a kind of crippling arrogance, unless those claims were actually true. And notice as well that this figure of Jesus isn't someone you can just dismiss. Lewis talked about this, that you only have a limited range of options. You know, is he a lunatic? Is he a liar? Is this some kind of legend? or is he, in fact, the Lord? And none of those alternative explanations really hold water. They don't stand up to reason. When you read the Gospels, it's so clear that the disciples couldn't have just made up this stuff. There's an air of truth to it. It's historically grounded. There are things there that you would not expect to be there unless they were true. The English writer J.R.R. Tolkien, he made this point. He said that there is no tale ever told that men would rather find was true, and yet, he said, there is no tale ever told which so many skeptical men have accepted as true on its own merits. That the Christian message, this greatest story ever told, is, yes, it's the greatest story ever told, but it's also historically grounded. And it's something that so many skeptics have come to believe in, despite their best efforts. Okay, so what does the Christian say in response to the Stoics, in response to Jordan Peterson? The Christian says this. He says the infallible man does exist. Who is the infallible man? He's the God-man, the perfect man, Jesus Christ. And he is a man whose words have real power. He doesn't just offer us rules for life, he offers us life itself, the fullness of life, and the power and the grace to transform our lives and to share in the divine life. It's a vision, a grand vision, that someone like Marcus Aurelius could only ever glimpse of. And so what do we do about hypocritical Christians? And why is it that the grace that Christ gives seems so unapparent? Well, here's an analogy I want to borrow from the 19th century German theologian, Matthias Schieben. Schieben makes the point that grace, Christian grace, can be compared to light. And you think of light and how little we understand it scientifically. We're not even sure, we don't know if it's a particle, whether it's a wave. And yet, who can deny its effects? Without light, we wouldn't know anything. We wouldn't understand anything. And we see the exact same thing with grace. Look, we may not fully understand it. We may not always understand where nature ends and grace begins. But that's because on the Christian view, nature and grace are deeply interwoven. Grace isn't this kind of double-decker reality where it's sort of slapped on top of nature. It's much more like, it's like the cream in your coffee or the sugar in your iced tea. That you're maybe not sure how to distinguish between the two, but its effects are clearly felt. You can taste the sugar. You can see the light. And we see this throughout the sacred scriptures of these different narratives of people that fail and fall, and yet they're redeemed by grace. We see it historically as well. I think today we have this sort of very cynical approach because we have so much comfort, so much wealth. But for the vast majority of people who have ever lived, life was really, really hard. It was full of suffering. And yet through it all, Christian grace, ever since the coming of Christ, allowed them to find meaning in that suffering and to build beautiful things out of it. And yet today, when we have all these things, we have wealth, we have prosperity, but we lack grace, we find that we're miserable, we're self-centered. We live in a society that's increasingly tyrannical. And so when you look at history, you look at the heights of Christendom, you see a society that cared for the weak and the vulnerable, a society that strove to abolish slavery, a society that secured the rights of women. All of that, of course, predicated on Christian virtue, Christian grace. And you compare that with today, where we have this descent into paganism, suicides are on the rise, marriage is being destroyed, the unborn children are not protected, and you see all of that. You see the effects of grace because you're seeing us living in a society that's turned its back on grace. And finally, I would say this, is we see the effects of grace in our personal lives. I hope this is the case for you as it is for me, that very much the happiest and the holiest people I've ever met were ones who possessed Christian virtue. And these people mind, they weren't like some Eastern philosopher who tried to ignore or transcend the human suffering in their life. No, these are people who entered into the suffering that God allowed them to endure. These are people that in some cases have suffered immensely, but they've been able to unite their sufferings to Christ. And in doing so, I really believe they're the kind of people that change the world. Those are effects of grace. So wrapping up, Jordan Peterson is someone who has a lot to offer us as Christians, and yet we need to insist that there's something more. Sticking with that analogy of light, we could say that it's like Jordan Peterson is someone who sees the beauty of the design of a stained glass window. He sees the details of the figures and the moral message, the parable which they often contain. But the problem is that he's still peering into the window from the outside. So yes, Jordan Peterson appreciates better than most, perhaps even better than us at times, how beautiful that window is. But think how much more beautiful it would be to him if he could examine it and meditate on it from within the church, to see not just the beautiful illustration, not just the great moral message, but to see the light shining through it, radiant and illuminating everything it touches. That is the power of grace. And I really, really believe that is what Jordan Peterson is ultimately searching for. Because you see, without that grace, without the Christian promise, the scriptures ultimately don't come to very much. You can preach discipline, you can preach virtue, you can talk about the need for hierarchy. But the hard-nosed reality is that there are many people out there who are not strong enough to help themselves. And even for those who can make progress, in the background of their consciousness, there's always going to remain that deep, unspoken existential fear, which haunted the pagans, which haunted the Stoics. It's that fear, that question of where is all this going? What is all this destined for? I often think of this as being like when you were at the beach as a kid, building sandcastles and the waves coming and toppling them. And then you'd rebuild the sandcastle and the waves would come again. But eventually the waves would come so much, the tide would move in so much that you had to give it up as a lost cause. And the sandcastle would fade into the beach and would be gone forever. And it seems to me, if I'm not being overly critical, Jordan Peterson offers us a great sandcastle. But deep down, we all realize we're made for something more. We're made for something lasting, something that transcends just living this life well lived, but something that points to the life to come. We're made for glory. We're made for eternity. We're made for that beautiful stained glass window with the light shining through. So I hope this has been helpful. I thank you for listening. If you have enjoyed this, please take a moment to comment below. Let me know what you think. And take a moment to subscribe as well to the St. Paul Center YouTube channel. We really appreciate that. Remember, life is short, so be a saint.